to start off by saying Happy Mother's Day. And, there's certain things that moms would say growing up. And for some of you, you hear your mom saying this on a regular basis. Some that are still in the house. And I don't know what it is for you, but I have a list of things that I've talked to some people about and that some I've just personally experienced. Things that your mother would say. And maybe at lunch you can start talking about those different things. I've already told Lance I want to know what his mom said. But with this, one of them, clean your plate. I'm sure you've heard that. Wait till your dad gets home. I'm not going to tell you again. I hope you don't do that in public. Hurry up because we're going to be late. And these two, this is kind of amusing. Are you itching for a licking? Are you looking for a whooping? Remember whose you are. Be sure to wear clean underwear in case you have a car accident. I know a lot of people heard that, and my grandma always said that to me. And I know there's other people that say, because it's apparently a popular thing. At one time, it was what everybody said. Another one is, let me know when the real, and you put your name in, like we'll use me. Let me know when the real Michael comes back. They were disappointed in that child. Another one is, put your napkin in your lap. Put your elbows off the table. Chew with your mouth closed. You don't do that on a date, do you? Don't slam the door. If you slam that door one more time, I'm going to take it off its hinges. Don't make me come in there. And so there's a lot of things that moms say that I'm sure in your household they may be a little bit different and some may be somewhat similar. But Mother's Day is a special day. Everybody has one, but sometimes those days are a little emotional when you don't have your mom with you anymore. And for us, we're going to look at a time when Jesus dealt with a mother. In Luke chapter 7. So if you have your Bible, turn to Luke chapter 7. We've been alphabetically going through the book of Luke. And so chapter 1 was angel announces. Chapter 2 was the birth of Christ. Chapter 3 was call of the wild. Chapter 4 was devil in the desert. Chapter 5 was every boat filled and everything left. Chapter 6 was a foolish builder. And then today it's going to be good deeds. But we're going to look at one good deed. There's many things that Jesus did in this chapter. We're going to look at one where he deals with a woman. More importantly, he deals with a mother. Some of us have lost. We've lost people, but when a family loses a child, doesn't matter how old the child is, when the child doesn't outlive the parents, it's tough. And we've had that. We've had that experience here and some loss. And that loss and that pain never goes away. And here, one man said there's the meeting of pairs, or there's two things that are meeting in this chapter. One, you have two crowds meeting. The crowd that Jesus is with and the crowd that the mourners are with, the mother's with. Another one says that there are two sons that are met. Two sons meet. There's the widow's son who is passed, and there's God's son. And two sufferers meet. You've got the woman, the widow, who's suffering and grieving, and then you have the man of sorrows. And you have two enemies that meet. You have death and the one that conquers death. But for us, we're going to take a look, starting in verse 11 of chapter 7 of Luke. We're going to look at three things that Jesus does. Because I think for us to fall in love with Jesus, that changes every dynamic. When we see a difficult command for us to follow, we're going to follow it if we love Jesus. But for us to do that, we need to see how he feels about us. And so, looking in verse 11, it says, soon afterward, he went to the town of Nain. And the disciples, and this is going to be about 7 miles from Nazareth. His disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, And for them, what they would do is they wouldn't put him in a coffin per se, even though some of your translations may say there was an open coffin. He was really laid upon a stack of maybe some wood kind of piled up together and roped off, kind of like what we call like a raft type of thing. It was a platform. They'd put the body and it would be wrapped. And so they would have the procession. And the woman, the person, the family that lost somebody would be in the front of the procession. And so in this situation, it's going to be the mother. She's going to be in the procession. And she'll be leading this. It goes on, it says, and the Lord saw her and had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Now, I want you to look at number one here. If you have your outline, you're following with us. Number one is Jesus sees. He notices. It says he saw her. He saw this woman in verse 13. And so Jesus, the next 2 points below are simple. Jesus, he can identify the situation. As he is drawing near, he identifies this procession coming. When we have a procession today, we'll see all this stream of cars. They're flashing their lights, aren't they? And what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to pull over, aren't we? We're supposed to pull over and wait for that procession to go. It wasn't very long ago, about 2 weeks ago, there was a procession that I was in. And cars are pulling over as you're going. And it's sobering when everybody pulls over and everybody waits for you to pass by because you've lost somebody. Well, he can identify the situation. And he can, the next point B, is he can identify the sorrow. He sees this woman, and this man has died, is being carried out. And as I mentioned, this woman would have been in front of the procession. She's a widow. That's her only son. She's all by herself. In that day and time, the man was the financial stability for the house. And so now she has no financial stability whatsoever. She's lost financially. But more importantly, she has lost her husband. And now, however many years it's been, now she's lost her son. And so she's walking. You can imagine the grief. I don't know if she has her head down. I don't know if she's walking very, very stoically. I'm not sure, but I know that he notices, and he sees that body being carried, and he sees that whole procession. He notices her. You know, if you look over, hold your spot here, but if you look over at John chapter 1, we see some things that Jesus notices. John chapter 1. We see that Jesus, he calls Philip, and then Philip, he goes and gets Andrew. And then you see another person coming. You see Nathanael. Nathanael comes up, and if you look in verse 47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, and he said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. And Nathan said to him, how do you know me? Jesus said, before Philip called you, you were under the fig tree. I saw you. And so we see that he can see things spiritually. It mentions in Matthew chapter 9, verse 2, and in Mark chapter 2, verse 5, he says he can see their faith. So spiritually, he saw a man that was seeking after him. He saw Nathanael. And he says it sees in Matthew and in Mark that he can see people's faith. That means he can see your faith. He can see when you're struggling and when your faith is full on strong. He can see you. And he knows what's going on. If you look in chapter 5. Chapter 5. There is, in verse 3, there was a multitude of people that were blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man had been an invalid for 38 years, in verse 5. And in verse 6, as some people would just pass on, he's been there, lying there by this pool for years. Some people would just pass by and just kind of, I see him, but I don't want to see him. I don't want to make eye contact. It doesn't say that. Jesus says he saw him there. Jesus, he not only sees those that are spiritually seeking, he sees those that are physically struggling. He saw him. And then if you go to chapter 9, verse 1. Now the disciples are going to say, hey, why is this man blind? Did he do something or did his parents do something? But in verse 1 of chapter 9 it says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And so he sees those that are disabled. He sees those that are spiritually struggling. He sees those that are spiritually seeking, and he sees those that are physically struggling. He sees us. And if you look at John 11, verse 33, we know verse 35. That's the shortest verse, right? Everybody knows that one. Shortest verse. Jesus wept. I got it. Well, look at verse 33 of chapter 11, verse 33. It says, Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come with her also weeping. He was deeply moved, because it talks about, in Romans chapter 12, we mourn with those who mourn. And so, he sees those that are emotionally hurting. You look in chapter 19. Look in chapter 19 and look in verse 26. Jesus is on the cross. And he sees his mother. He sees those that are emotionally hurting. You know his mom was hurting. He sees those that are spiritually seeking, and he sees those that are physically struggling. In other words, the truth of the matter is, Jesus sees you. You think about all the times that you've gone through any one of these, and maybe going through all of them right now at the same time. He sees you. He knows what's going on in your life. You aren't one of those people that you pull up to the stoplight and you see some guy asking for money, asking for some change. He's got a little dog there with him, got his little camp out there, and he's asking for something. And people you see rolling up you don't roll up the window this way, do you? You just punch a button now, you just roll it up. People rolling up and people putting hand, 2 and 10 on the steering wheel, looking ahead like they've never done before. Because most of the time they're looking down at their phone. But they're looking ahead and they're just looking at that light, look at that light, look at that light. Green, 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 green. And it finally turns green and they head on. Jesus doesn't do that. He sees them spiritually seeking. He sees them emotionally hurting. He sees them physically struggling. He sees them. He acknowledges them. He notices them. And the great news for us is that he acknowledges us. He notices when we're going through those same exact things. He can see our faith. He can see when we're wanting to strive towards him and we're wanting to veer away from him. He can see when we're just hurting emotionally with all the things that are going on. And he knows when we're physically just not where we'd like to be and we're struggling. He sees it. And he saw this woman. He notices her. And he hurts for her. And he tells her in verse 13, don't weep. And in verse 13, if you look back at Luke 7, it says, and when he saw her, so he notices, there's a lot of stuff just in this one verse, by the way, in verse 13. He sees her, and then it says he had compassion on her. And compassion, kind of a compound word, common passion, same feeling. He understands what she's going through. He feels for her. And so while he understands that, he has compassion on her when he sees and notices this woman who is a widow, this woman who lost her only son, and she's the head of this procession going on to lay him down. This happened. They didn't wait days and sometimes weeks and things like that. This is that day. He had died that day, and so they were putting him in a tomb that day. And so they're going to lay him in a tomb, and then they're going to come back in a year after all the flesh is deteriorated, and they're going to take those bones and they're going to put those in a box. And if she doesn't have any money, which she probably didn't, they're going to put it in a box of other family members' bones. And so they're going to lay him in a tomb, and that's where they're going. They're going to put him in a tomb, and they're going to seal it up, just like they did Christ. And so he has compassion on her. And so point number 2 is Jesus cares. He not only sees you, he cares. And in letter A, Jesus' interest is evident in his compassion. He is interested in her. He could care less of all the things going on. His focus is dialed in right now on this mother. The next point is Jesus' interest is evident in his consideration, because he does take time to visit with her. In verse 13 it says, and he said to her. He considers her. He considers the situation. He notices her. He actually has compassion on her. And then he considers her. He speaks to her. Now, it's tough to know what to say when someone's passed away to their loved one. It's difficult to say anything. And I think the only thing that you can say is, I love you and I'm praying for you. But Jesus, whatever he says, he can back up. You know, if I say, hey, it's going to be all right, you don't know that. I say, well, you got another child. Well, are you kidding me? I lost a child. Why would you want to tell me I got another one? You know, some of those insensitive things. You know, sometimes people acting like they don't remember the name of a lost child. Man, that hurts too. That stings too, just like they never were born. There's a lot of things that we say not intentionally doing, but Jesus, he knows the right thing to say. He goes up to her, considers her, and he says, do not weep, because he can back it up. If I sit there and say, well, hey, it's going to be all right. Don't be crying about it. If someone spills some milk or whatever the situation, no, I can't take that away. I can't remove it, but Jesus can. Don't weep. And so as this takes place, go to Matthew. Go to Matthew chapter 8. Because we're going to see some other things that take place in chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, we're going to see that he cares for the struggling. That means those that are struggling spiritually, physically, emotionally. Struggling. When you're struggling, you look in verse 2, this leper says, he comes up, he kneels before the Lord and says, if you will, you can make me clean. There's a man that's struggling. He's been ostracized by his community. He's not able to worship like everyone else in his community. He's completely ostracized. And he has to live separate and apart from everybody else. If they ever celebrated a Mother's Day, in their culture, he wouldn't have been there because he can't be close to his family. And here he says, if you're willing, you could help. And Jesus says this in verse 3, it says he stretched out his hand, he touched him and says, I'm willing, be clean. He had compassion for this leper. And so, not only that, but go to 20. Go to chapter 20. We could be flipping all over the gospel of all these different things, but I'm trying to get it all, in one book in each one, just so you don't have to do as much flipping. Because if you were to look at how many times he shows that he cares, there's a plethora. And you just keep on looking. We'd be looking all day. And that's just the things that were written about him. Chapter 20. If you looked at chapter 20, verse 34, it says you have these two blind men. And they're crying out in verse 30, Lord, have mercy on us. And in verse 34, it says, Jesus in pity touched their eyes. Man, he cared about them. He cares about that leper that nobody else would be touching. He cares about these men that are born blind. It's amazing that, all the different things that he does and how he cares. If you look in chapter 9, there's a group of people that he's teaching and he's proclaiming, and all these disciples gone all over, and they're coming back reporting all the things that they've done. And he sees this crowd in verse 36 of chapter 9. And it says he has compassion on them because they were because they were helpless, they were harassed, they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he has compassion for those that are lost. He has pity for the blind. He has compassion for the leper. Look over in chapter 14. Chapter 14 and verse 14. Well, if you look in verse 13, chapter 14, verse 13. Now Jesus heard this, he withdrew. Now what he just heard was that that John the baptizer had died. So that's his cousin. He just hears that he dies, and so he withdraws. Trying to be by himself a little bit, he withdraws, and he goes from there in a boat to a desolate place. And then in verse 14, when he saw ashore, he saw a great crowd. Now he's hurting. Because you talking about a difficult day in Jesus' life. Chapter 14 would be a difficult day in Jesus' life. He's lost his cousin. He's been beheaded. And so he hears the news and he wants to get away, but these crowds just keep coming. And it says in verse 14, he went ashore and he saw this great crowd. It says he had compassion on them and he healed the sick. He felt for them. So when you're struggling, you've got a Savior that cares. And so the truth of the matter is, Jesus cares for you. He doesn't just care in general. He cares for you. If you looked over in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, it says, don't be anxious or cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. And so we've got a Savior that cares for us. We've got one that sees us in our situation, in our circumstance. And going back to Luke chapter 7, going back to this widow, she's all alone, but Jesus notices her. Even though she's with this procession, she's feeling all alone. But Jesus notices her. He has compassion on her. He considers her. He talks to her. And then in verse 14, it says he came up and he touched where the vessel that they're holding this body in. And it says, young man, I say to you, arise. The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to the mother. Now, Jesus, point number 3, Jesus helps. He not just sees a situation, because we can notice a situation and just kind of move on by, but he notices and he does something about it. He not only notices and helps, but he notices and he cares about it and he helps. He cares about that person. There's a lot of people that, I've always said that worldly problems are solved by money. You throw enough money at it and a worldly problem is satisfied with it. But Jesus doesn't just give money to it. He puts himself in it. He actually cares. He has compassion for this woman and he helps her. He had to notice her. He had to have a heart to be able to do something about it. And then he had the ability to do something. So he hits every one of those check marks. Point A, not only does Jesus help, but it says Jesus, he intervenes in a resurrection. Now, he's going to intervene in his own resurrection too, but he raises this man up from the dead. This young man, he comes to life. I don't even know how old he is, but can you imagine the mom? Can you imagine the mother? Tears in my mind, I'm not seeing her stoic. In my mind, I'm seeing tears flowing down and her weeping and her wailing and just beyond herself. And then all of a sudden, he interferes with the procession. He interferes with this ritual of going and taking this body to the tomb. And he stops everything. And he says, don't weep. And he goes up and he says, get up. And that young man gets up. Can you imagine what that would have been like that day? Because everybody is mourning. Then all of a sudden the mourning is turning to amazement and shock. Because now his body's probably still wrapped up. And he's probably moving, these wrappings from his body. And now he's alive. Next point. Jesus intervened in a restoration. Because look in verse 15, it says, the dead man sat up. In other words, the guy that was dead, he's not dead now, sat up and he began to speak. And then there you go with the restoration. Jesus gives this boy back to mom. And so we see a Jesus that sees us and he cares and he helps. He helped this mom. And she was desperate. She was struggling. And you think about what Jesus does for us. He helps us. Matter of fact, In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18, it says he's able to help us when we're being tempted, because he knows what it's like to be tempted. And he is able to help us when we're tempted. In Colossians chapter 2:11, it talks about, when it talks about being baptized, it talks about the circumcision done with Christ. So Jesus he goes to town, he goes to work, and he is helping us spiritually have that sin removed from us. Because it talks about the working of God taking place. So he helps us spiritually. He helps us when we're tempted. And in Luke chapter 18, go over there right quick. Luke chapter 4, chapter 4, since you're here in this book. Chapter 4, verse 18. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And the reason why I mention this is because they came up and they were asking what's going on. And he unrolls this scroll and it says, "The Spirit of the Lord has come upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the liberties to the captives and recovering of the sight to the blind, and set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He talks about what Jesus was going to be doing. He reads this prophecy from Isaiah about him, and he's saying, this is what I'm going to be doing. I am going to be helping people physically. And he talks about how he's going to be helping people spiritually as well here. You go back to chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, verse 22. And they're asking, are you the one? John's followers are saying, are you the one, or should we look for another? And in 22, he answers, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." Man, he helps spiritually. He helps physically. And he helps emotionally, because I mentioned earlier in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, it says, "Cast your anxiety on him because he cares for you." He can help out in every situation. He can help you out physically. He can help you out spiritually. And he can help you out emotionally. We've got the Savior that can help out in all situations. And so the truth of the matter is, Jesus helps you. He sees you. He cares about you. And he helps you. That is amazing. So the charge we have is very simple. The charge we have is that we need to be like Jesus. That means we need to see others. We need to go and start looking around. And you don't have to look very far to see folks that are needing some help, some folks that are struggling. We need to make sure that we see others. We need to make sure that we care for others. And not just have a heart for them and feel bad about it, but we need to go the next step. We need to help others. We need to be like Jesus, as he talks about here. And it mentions that Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." We need to be like Jesus. 1 Peter talks about it too. We need to walk in his steps. 1 John mentions it in chapter 2, verse 6. Walk as Jesus did. We need to be like Jesus. That means we don't need to have a closed eyes and go on and say, well, that just happens. But we need to be looking. We need to be searching. We need our heart to be softened, and we need to go helping folks. Here on this Mother's Day, there's a mother that was indeed struggling. But if you look in chapter 7, going back to chapter 7 here, something takes place. Because when Jesus sees and he cares and he helps, this is what happens. In verse 16, it says, "Fear seized them all." Because this guy was dead and now he's sat up and he's talking. Fear seized them all, and here's what happened next. They glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." And the report about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. When we let our light shine, as it talks about in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, we let our light shine, then God is going to get the praise. Because that's what it talks about. It says, let your light shine before men so they will glorify your God in heaven. So that's what just took place. He did this and they glorified God because of what the Son did. I'm hoping that we're the people that the way we live this week glorifies God. And that people glorify God in what we're doing, by how we're living, by how we're talking. This lesson is not the typical Mother's Day lesson, but this is a time when Jesus gave back to a woman, to a mother who is hurting. And there may be someone here hurting. And if there is, let us know what we can be doing to help you, to pray for you. Not just to see it and watch it, but to really care and really help. Because we know that we can go to the Father on your behalf, and He's the one that can always help. And if you haven't become a Christian and you want to become a Christian, then let's study and let's see what God says that we need to do to become a Christian. I know the world says a whole lot of things, but let's see what the Bible says about it. But whatever your need, please come while we stand and sing.